All right, in this lecture, we're going to be going over composition. So what is composition? Well, composition just comes down to basically where you place your objects in your image, as well as what kind of contrast and values your image has, and that all creates your composition. So I like to break down composition into 5 basic rules for composition. Now, you don't always have to follow these rules. In fact, I highly encourage that you break them sometimes just so you can experiment. Now, a lot of people will tell you that these rules cannot be broken if you want to create good artwork, but if you talk to any really good artist, almost all of them will tell you that you can break these rules whenever you feel like it. But they're really good to understand and use as a guide for creating your compositions in your art. So the first one is central composition. So central composition is just when it says that there's an object in the center of your image, and that's going to be your focal point. And just by putting it in the center, that makes it your focal point. So for example, let's say that we draw a building right here in the middle of our image, okay? So there's our building. Now, a lot of the time in central compositions, you're going to have your vanishing point in one point perspective right in the center along with your object. So if we put our vanishing point right there, we'll have vanishing lines coming off like so, or perspective lines. And then what we could do is we could go ahead and align these perspective lines with trees. So let's say we have a tree right here. And then as it comes down to the next area of the vanishing line, we're going to go ahead and add another tree in, but this tree will be a little bit taller because of perspective. And we'll just continue to do that all the way down. We'll do the same thing on the other side. And then we'll add one more tree right here. But even though, once we erase away these vanishing lines, they're still going to be there subconsciously. You're going to know that there are vanishing lines going off to this vanishing point, and all of that points to the center. Plus our object is in the center. Plus we can also darken our object so that it's more of the focal point because it'll stand out more because there's more contrast between our object and our background now. But that is central composition. The next one is called the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds says that if you break up your image into thirds, you can use this as a guide to create a good composition. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw 2 lines like so and make sure that the distance between each line and the edges of my page are about a third apart. And so now I know that anything that I put on these lines are probably going to be a good bet for where I want to position an object in my drawing. Then you can also go ahead and break the horizontal lines of your page up into thirds also, like so. Now generally this top line or this bottom line are the best place to put your horizon line. So most of the time people put their horizon line down here at the bottom. So let's say that we make this bottom area our horizon line. And then let's say that we want to add in an object. So let's say we want to add in a person. Well, we'd probably want to put our person right here on this line because this is the rule of thirds, is saying that you want to put things on these lines, and that will help your image look really good. So there's one person right there on that third line. We have a horizon line on this third line. And then we can even fill up a whole third of an area with an object too. So let's say this whole area right here, we want to fill that most of that in with something. So I'm going to add in a house that basically takes up the entire third of my image. So I can go ahead and add in a window right there and even a door. So now that takes up that third. Now the next rule is called focal point contrast. Now what this is just contrast within your focal point. So like we've gone over before, it's basically just drawing the viewer's eye into whatever you want by creating as much contrast as possible. And contrast can be created in many different ways, through line quality, through values, so we can put contrasting values next to each other. You can also do it with color if you're using color in your drawings, and you can also use it by doing texture in your drawings, by having contrasting textures. So let's try an example. So let's say that we have an object right here in our drawing. Let's say that it's an apple, okay? So there's our apple. Now we're going to make this apple a white glowing apple. So by adding in a glow around the edge of our apple and making our dark ground really black, it's going to create that focal point contrast. So let's go ahead and fill our background in with a darker color. And as we get closer up to the edge of our apple, we're going to fade that in to the white value around it, so it looks like the apple is actually glowing. All right, great. Now, another thing, like I said, we can do is we can add in some contrasting texture. So for example, let's say that our background is a really rough texture, and then we're going to leave our apple a very smooth texture. So we're not even going to add any texture to our apple, but we might add some really harsh texture to our background. And as we get up to the edge of our apple, we're going to leave that texture out. Then we can go ahead and darken these edges just a little bit more also. And so now we've really created some focal point contrast by creating two different textures. One is the apple, which is very smooth and has no texture at all, and then our really rough background texture. Then we also created focal point contrast by adding in a dark background and then leaving it really bright around the apple and leaving the apple completely white. So we have that contrasting values that creates that focal point. So as soon as you look at this drawing, your eye goes directly to that apple. All right, the next composition type is depth of field. So we've already kind of gone over this with detail when we went over how to create space in your drawings. But depth of field is basically just blurring one layer of your image and keeping another layer in focus. So for example, let me draw a little diagram really quick. So let's say that we have a person right here, and then further up we have some trees in our composition, like so. And we can see the tops of those branches. And then let's say that we have our background, which has some mountains on it. Well, if you're taking a picture of this with a camera, what your camera is going to do is it's going to focus on one of these layers because they're at different distances. So if you wanted to focus on this character right here, then this character would be really sharp and have hard edges and lots of detail. Then the next layer would be a little bit out of focus, meaning it would be a little bit blurry. And then by the time you got to this background area, because it's the furthest one away, it would be very blurry. Now you could change the depth of field by focusing on this middle layer, and so now that would be really sharp and have a lot of detail, and then this character would be blurry and this background would be blurry. So when you're creating a depth of field with drawing, it can be a little bit difficult, but it can still be done. But it's something you definitely want to understand when it comes to creating artwork. So let's say we're going to recreate this image right here, but rather than having these trees here, we're just going to go ahead and add the background in. So first off, I'm going to start off by sketching out a really light character. So we're just going to show the shoulders up. So there's my character. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add in my background. So in this background, we're going to have some mountains, just like so. And maybe there's going to be a few trees down here at the bottom, like so. Then we might add a little bit more detail onto this mountain. All right, perfect. So our background is going to be in focus and our character is going to be out of focus. So that means we want the edges of our character to be very blurry. So we're going to start off kind of lighter and then we'll work our way to darker colors. But we want to make sure that the edge of this character is blurred so it's out of focus. And so now, just by creating that gradual gradient from my dark value to the lighter value of my background, I created the illusion that my character is blurry and out of focus. But now I've created that depth of field, so it looks like you're looking past the character and to the background, and that really creates a focal point by making whatever you want your viewer to look at in focus and making other things out of focus. Now let's go over the last one, symmetry and balance. So asymmetry basically means that your object is the opposite of symmetrical, meaning that the things on both sides of your lines, if we divide our drawing up into the middle, things on both sides of that line do not match up. They don't reflect each other. So let me show you what I mean. So if we have a bottle right here, if this was symmetrical, we would add another bottle in the same exact spot on the other side. But we want this to be asymmetrical because it makes our composition much more interesting. So over here, we might add a book. Like so. Go ahead and add some pages to that book, darken in the cover. So this is asymmetry. So this makes your drawings much more interesting. If they're completely symmetrical, they're going to look really boring. But you also want to keep in mind that you want to create something called balance. And balance just means that your image is filled on both sides. Now, like I said, sometimes you can break composition rules, and so sometimes you don't want your image to be balanced, meaning that one side might have an object and the other side has nothing on it. That would create an imbalance in your drawing. Right now, our drawing is pretty balanced because we have an object that is relatively the same size on both sides of our drawing. If we were to add a pumpkin on this side, behind our bottle, like so, and then we were to add a bowl over here, I'm going to go ahead and outline my composition so we can see where we are a little bit more. Well, now it's out of balance. This doesn't look right because this side has much more stuff. But if I were to go ahead and add in a few more things on this side, I don't really know what, just a ball and whatever else I wanted to, maybe another bottle back here. Well, that kind of balances it out a little bit more. The middle of our composition is looking a little bit bare, so I'm going to add an object right there too. But now our image is looking much more balanced. Now let's look at an example of something being imbalanced. So if we were to draw an image like so, and then let's say we had a horizon line like this, and then let's say we had a character out here standing on our horizon line. And that was the entire image, just the foreground, the sky, and our character. Well, this is imbalanced because there's only one object on this side and there's nothing on this side. Now, something we could do to make this more balanced is we could go ahead and add a hill on this side of our horizon line, like so. And that kind of balances out our entire image. So it's almost like you have to imagine that each object and thing that you add to one side of your image, whether it's the sides of your image or the top and the bottom, are kind of like weight. And so if it's imbalanced, it's going to topple over. But also keep in mind, like I said, you can always break these rules. So just because you have a character on a flat horizon line, so let's go ahead and erase this hill. Just because you have a character on a flat horizon line and it's imbalanced does not mean there's anything wrong with that. Sometimes that works, and sometimes you want to do that because it makes your viewer feel uncomfortable, and that might be what you're trying to create with your viewer. Alright, that brings us to the end of this lecture. So in this lecture, we learned 5 basic composition rules. So the first one we learned is central, which is where you put your focal point in the center of your image, and then you have lines pointing to that center image. If we wanted to, we could also add in other lines in here that are in perspective that would also point to our center image. Next is the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds says that if you break your image up into thirds, wherever those lines are, if you put your objects on those lines or fill those areas in, that you're going to create a nice looking composition. The next one is focal point contrast. So focal point contrast says that whatever you create contrast between is going to be your focal point. Whatever has the most contrast, meaning in value, in texture, and in line, that's going to be your focal point. Then the next one was depth of field. Depth of field is just where you blur one layer of your image in order to create a focal point on another area of your image. Then the last one is asymmetry and balance. So you want to keep things asymmetrical. That way your image still looks interesting. So like here we have all kinds of different objects. It's not copied onto this other side of our symmetrical line. And so it makes it look much more interesting. But then you also want to keep in mind that you want your composition to stay relatively balanced. But then we also learned that sometimes it's okay to create imbalance, especially if you want your viewer to feel a little uncomfortable. And it's not always that they'll feel uncomfortable. Sometimes you can just break this rule and it's fine. It just makes for an interesting looking composition. All right, thanks for watching this lecture, and I really look forward to seeing you in the next one.